All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to completely change the way you read and, more importantly, the way you hear poetry. We often think of poetic meter as this super rigid, dusty academic rule, right? Just a bunch of lines and slashes on a chalkboard that totally drain the life out of a good poem. But what if I told you that meter is actually the living, breathing heartbeat of human storytelling? Today, we are demystifying poetic meter. We're going to see how poets across completely different cultures use the rhythms of language to manipulate our emotions, guide our breath, and essentially whisper stage directions right into our ears. So, here is the quick roadmap for our explainer today. We'll be covering the rhythm of poetry, English meter, Shakespeare's meaningful variations, Persian metras, and finally, the pulse of emotion. Let's get started.
Section 1. The rhythm of poetry and finding our natural speech pulse.
Before we get bogged down in any technical jargon, we need to understand that the rhythm of poetry isn't something forced on us from the outside. It's actually hiding right there inside our natural speech. To really hear this underlying pulse, you've got to interact with it. And there's a simple 3-step trick for this. First, just read a line of poetry aloud, nice and slowly. Second, and honestly this is the most crucial part, don't force a rigid sing-song beat. Poetry works because it mimics actual speech, not because it overrides it. And third, just gently tap your finger on the stressed syllables as you speak. What you're listening for here is this incredibly beautiful tension between the underlying metrical pattern and the natural everyday weight of English words. The meter pulls one way, the meaning pulls another, and the magic? Well, that happens right in the middle. Moving on to Section 2, Stress and Feet in English meter. So, how exactly do we measure this rhythm in English? We use what's called an accentual syllabic system. Now, I know that sounds super complex, but it literally just means our rhythm depends entirely on counting syllables and figuring out which ones are stressed and which ones are unstressed. And our primary tool for mapping this out is called scansion. Scansion is just the process of marking those stressed and unstressed syllables in a line to spot the pattern. Think of it as mapping out the actual heartbeat of a verse, so we can pop the hood and see exactly what the poet is doing. This brings us to the building blocks of that map, which we call poetic feet. A foot is basically just a unit of measurement for syllables. And the absolute king of these in English is the iamb. That's an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one, dum. For example, alone, because, today. The iamb isn't some weird foreign pattern. It's literally the most natural rhythmic unit the English language produces. We've also got the trochee, which flips it around to dum-da. And then there are triple meters like the anapest, da-da-dum, or the dactyl, dum-da-da. But for sure, the iamb rules the roost in English.
All right, Section 3. Shakespeare's meaningful variations. This is where we get into meaningful rule breaking.
Now, Shakespeare wrote mostly in Iambic Pentameter. That's 5 iambs per line, 10 syllables total. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. But here's the ultimate secret. He established this perfect baseline specifically so he could act as a calculated rule breaker. Let's look at one of his absolute favorite ways to mess with the rules, the feminine ending. This variation casually drops an extra unstressed 11th syllable right at the end of a line. So instead of landing solidly on a firm, stressed dum, the line just trails off into an unstressed da. It leaves the whole thing hanging open. Shakespeare uses this trick brilliantly to mirror characters who are dealing with psychological instability, questioning, or just deep, deep uncertainty. Take Hamlet's most famous line, for example. To be or not to be, that is the question. Notice that final tation? That is our feminine ending. The line just refuses to resolve. It hangs in the air, totally incomplete. It is the absolute perfect metrical reflection of a mind that is entirely unable to reach a definitive conclusion. Literally, the meter is doing the acting before the actor even speaks. But what happens when that uncertainty turns into absolute, crushing devastation? Well, then we get metrical collapse. This is the complete and total disruption of the iambic pattern to express extreme emotional fracture. If the feminine ending is a subtle trailing off, metrical collapse is the sound of the meter literally snapping under the weight of pure grief. Think about King Lear holding his dead daughter, crying out, "Never, never, 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 never." That is 5 consecutive stressed syllables, 5 trochees. It is as far from that natural da-dum iambic pattern as you could possibly get. The meter has shattered because what it was trying to contain has shattered. Lear's agony visually and auditorily breaks the entire iambic baseline.
Okay, we are pivoting to the east now for Section 4, measuring time with Persian meters.
Classical Persian poetry uses the aruz system, which was adapted from Arabic. And here we completely replace the English heartbeat of stress with a highly precise clock. The mechanics here are fascinating contrast. In our English system, rhythm is all about stress, literally how hard we hit the syllable. But the Persian system is what we call quantitative. It depends strictly on duration. We're talking about the actual physical length of time it takes your mouth to utter a syllable. You aren't tapping out a beat, you are essentially running a stopwatch.
To give you an idea of just how insanely precise this is, there are 3 distinct Persian syllable lengths. You've got short syllables ending in a short vowel, you've got long syllables ending in a long vowel or a consonant, and then, really uniquely, you have overlong syllables, which mathematically act as a long plus a short. The researcher L.P. Elwell Sutton actually sat down and measured these in hundredths of a second. A short syllable averages just about 0.2 seconds. A long is about a third of a second, and overlong approaches 0.6 seconds. It is a stunningly exact mathematical system of vocal duration.
Because it is so wonderfully precise, classical Persian poets were remarkably disciplined. Get this, out of a sample of over 20,000 lyric poems, over 90% adhere strictly to just 3 main rhythmic patterns. Pattern 4 totally dominates at nearly 44%, followed closely by patterns 2 and 3. They are relying on these beautifully complex yet mathematically perfect frameworks.
So you might be wondering, how on earth do Persian poets create any variety without breaking the strict stopwatch? Well, they substitute. A Persian poet can swap in one overlong syllable anywhere the meter is expecting a long plus a short. By doing this, they actually condense the total syllable count of the line, which completely alters the visual structure, while perfectly, mathematically maintaining the exact same vocal timing. It's absolutely brilliant.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, the pulse of emotion.
We've looked at the English stress system and the Persian time system. Mechanically, they are worlds apart, but their ultimate goal is beautifully identical. We see the true power of that shared goal in the words of the 13th century Persian poet Sa'di from his famous poem Bani Adam. In the original Persian, this is written in a perfectly structured 11-syllable verse called the Mokharab meter. It uses that strict Persian clock to deliver a profound, universally resonant truth, a truth that literally hangs in the halls of the United Nations today. It hits the listener just as powerfully as a perfectly placed English stress. So here is the absolute crucial takeaway for this entire explainer. The meter is the baseline. Any departure from that baseline is information. Whether you're counting the stresses of an English iamb or you're measuring the vocal duration of a Persian syllable, poetic meter is never, ever just a rule to follow blindly. It serves as an embedded emotional stage direction. It tells the reader exactly how to feel, when to take a breath, and when to let raw emotion completely shatter the structure. I want to leave you with this final thought. We've seen exactly how poets harness rhythm to capture the human experience. But what about you? What is the underlying rhythm of your own daily speech? And what emotions make you break that rhythm? The next time you find yourself speaking passionately about something, just listen closely. You might just find a beautiful poetic meter hiding right inside your own everyday conversations. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep listening for the rhythm.